So another type of division that you learned is what's called synthetic division. Remember, long division works all the time. The problem is synthetic division doesn't always work all the time. The only time you can use synthetic division is when your divisor is in the form of x plus or minus k. The coefficient of x needs to be a positive 1. It needs to be an x to the first plus or minus a constant. First of all, you want to write the coefficients for each term, and again, you want to make sure the polynomial is written in standard form. When we say standard form, remember, it has to be with the largest exponent for x coming first, and each exponent needs to be represented in descending order. That means you may need to have a placeholder of 0 if you need to. So for example, taking a look at number 7, you can use synthetic division because your divisor is in the form of 1x plus or minus a number. So when I set up my synthetic division, notice my first polynomial is in standard form because I'm starting with an x to the third. I've got my x squared, my x to the first, and my constant, which actually has an x to the 0. So I'm going to line up my coefficients at the top. Remember, the coefficient of x is 1. Now, the next step is you want to take the opposite of the constant in the divisor, which means you want to find the 0. Remember, x minus 3 is a factor. So the 0 is going to come from taking x minus 3 and setting it equal to 0, which is x equals 3. So 3 is what I'm going to put in front of my synthetic division. So then the next step is I'm going to bring down the very first coefficient, which in this case is 6. So the process is then I'm going to multiply the 0 by that very first coefficient, and 3 times 6 is 18. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to place that underneath my next coefficient. I'm going to add what's on the inside. Negative 19 plus 18 is a negative 1. I'm going to repeat the process, multiply my 0 by the next term. 3 times negative 1 is negative 3. I place that underneath my next coefficient, and I add on the inside of the rectangle that I drew. 1 plus negative 3 is negative 2. Again, last time I'm going to multiply 3 times negative 2, which is negative 6. Add 6 plus negative 6, which is a 0. I always circle this last number. That's my remainder. So in this particular case, I have no remainder. What I have here are the coefficients of my answer. Remember, we started with a 6x to the third, and we're dividing out an x. So what happens is I know the very first term is going to have to be an x squared. And the coefficient of x squared will be a 6. So I have 6x squared. After x squared would be an x to the first. So the negative 1 is that coefficient of x to the first. And then my constant is a minus 2. And I have 0 as a remainder, so I don't have to worry about writing that fraction. So that is my answer. So next one is x to the third plus 2x squared minus 5x plus 12, already written in standard form. So I'm going to line up my coefficients at the top. So starting with the coefficient of x to the third, which is 1, I have a 2, a negative 5, and a 12. Remember, synthetic division only works if that divisor is a 1x plus or minus a number, which it is. So remember, x plus 4 is your factor. The 0 is what goes in front here in the synthetic division, so that's going to be a negative 4. So I bring down the very first coefficient, which is 1. I'm going to multiply negative 4 times 1, which is negative 4, put that underneath my next coefficient. Add on the inside, 2 plus negative 4 is negative 2. Multiply negative 4 times negative 2, which is 8. Add negative 5 plus 8, which is a 3. Multiply negative 4 times 3, which is negative 12. 12 plus negative 12 is 0. And remember, that last number is your remainder. So I started with an x to the third. I'm dividing out an x, so I know the very first term is going to have to be an x squared. So the coefficient of x squared is a 1. So I have 1x squared. After x squared will be my x, and the coefficient of x is going to be a minus 2x. And then my constant is 3, and the remainder is a 0. So there is my answer. Remember, synthetic division only works when the divisor is in the form of 1x plus or minus a number. So now if you look at number 9, this one's different because you're starting with an x to the third. You're missing a term with x squared and an x. So this is where you're going to have to put those placeholder of 0. So the coefficient of x to the third is 1. There is no x squared, so I have to write a 0x squared. And then a 0x, and then my constant is negative 64. Remember, synthetic division only works when the divisor is a 1x plus or minus a constant. Remember, this is your factor, x minus 4. What goes in the front is your 0, so that's just going to be a 4. You bring down the very first coefficient, which is a 1. 4 times 1 is 4. You add on the inside, 0 plus 4 is 4. Multiply 4 times 4, which is 16. Add what's on the inside, 0 plus 16 is 16. Multiply 4 times 16, which is 64. Add what's on the inside, and you end up with a remainder of 0. So again, you started with an x to the third, and you're dividing out an x. So x to the third divided by an x means I'm going to start with an x squared for my answer. So the coefficient of x squared is a 1. Put my powers in descending order. The next is going to be an x. The coefficient of x would be my 4. And then I have my plus 16 as my constant. So last example for synthetic division. Notice I've got my x to the third, x squared, x to the first, and my constant, so I don't have to worry about placeholders. So I'm going to line up my coefficients at the top, 2, -3, 4, -5. Again, the divisor, I can do synthetic division since it's in the form of 1x plus or minus my number. X minus 2 is my factor. 2 is the 0 that goes in the front. Bring down your very first coefficient, which is 2. 2 times 2 is 4. That goes underneath my next coefficient. Remember, you add on the inside. -3 plus 4 is 1. Multiply again. 2 times 1 is 2. That goes underneath my next coefficient. And 4 plus 2 is 6. Multiply 2 times 6. That gives me a 12. I'm going to place that underneath -5. -5 plus 12 is a 7. Remember, this last number is your remainder. So this example is going to have a remainder. I started with a 2x to the third. I'm dividing out an x, so I know the very first term has to have an x squared in it, and the 2 is the coefficient for x squared. Plus, the next variable would be my x to the first, so that coefficient is a 1x. Plus 6. Just like with long division, if you have a remainder, you're going to write your plus sign and you have to make a fraction. So you're going to take your remainder, which is 7, divide it by your divisor, which is your x minus 2, whatever comes after the division sign. So that is your final answer. Remember, synthetic division does not work all the time. Long division does. The only time you can use long division is when your divisor is in the form of 1x plus or minus a number. Otherwise, you have to do long division.